Oh, it's an O. It really is an O.
Just want to make sure.
Just, yes. There's no relationship whatsoever to the former Italian. Okay. Although I have to say, growing up in France, I heard it mispronounced so many times. I heard so many jokes about that. Can you all hear me, by the way? I'm not going to use a mic. Yes? Wonderful.
Yes, we're good.
Are we good with, do you think we should turn maybe these lights off and keep those on so that the screen is, okay, good. Light and full speed. Okay. Up to you. We can't make eye contact now. I can't see into your soul. That's terrible. No, if this works for you, then it works for me. Oh, how about the camera, the video? You're not going to be able to catch anything with that, right? Yeah, there we go. Beautiful. Beautiful. So, hi everyone. It's a real pleasure to meet all of you. I absolutely love doing events like this one. I love talking about ideas. I love stepping out of the ivory tower to come meet people who are eager to hear about what we think in our little bubble. And I must tell you that when I'm done presenting, the thing that I look forward to the most is the Q&A session. I love that. So, as I present to you, feel free to ask questions if they're questions of clarification. But if you have a deep, urging, burning philosophical question, maybe let's wait until the end of the presentation so we can get into it, okay? I'm going to throw a lot of stuff out there. So, to set the stage for this discussion, for this presentation, I'd like to start by showing you a short video clip that beautifully captures the main idea that I'm going to talk about. So hopefully the sound is all set up so we can I can just click and we can watch. So let's watch. Very clever ad. So if any of you are driving back home today, make sure you buckle up. Heaven can indeed wait. So this, of course, raises the question of the soul, as you saw in this little clip. A question that has haunted, if I may say, the imagination of our species for millennia, if not longer. So today I want to ask or think about a number of questions that surround this notion of the soul. Who believes in the soul today? I'll ask. What kind of soul do people believe in? Why do people believe in the soul and not some other supernatural entity? Does science have anything to say about the soul? And if so, what can we learn from science about the soul? What are the implications? What follows from what science can tell us, if anything, about human nature, and whether or not, yes, there's a question already. Yeah. I love that. I haven't even started.
Yes, no, you have started actually. How is the soul defined? As you stated there, what is the soul? What is the soul you expect us to believe in?
Great question. If you give me 30 more seconds, I'll give you a very precise definition. How about that? Anchored in empirical evidence. Makes you happy?
Very
fantastic. So, beautiful. But that's a great question, exactly. I'm not going to talk about some diffuse thing. I'm going to be very precise. And of course, why should anyone care about such questions? Is it just an academic exercise, or is it meaningful beyond the ivory tower? Does it have implications for issues that we all care about? So this is what I discuss, all these questions I discuss in my book, my recent book, The Soul Fallacy, conveniently located here in the back of the room, for sale today for $15 you get a good deal because it's actually more expensive if you buy it at the store or on Amazon, and I get to sign it for you. So it's a great deal, unbeatable. A thing of beauty, as somebody recently said. So what I'm going to do today is what the Hollywood industry does whenever a new movie comes out. They show you a trailer. It's a teaser. It's all the best scenes and all the action and all the important stuff. So that's what I'm going to do because I don't have 10 hours to present the whole book. Now, I want to mention at the outset an important caveat. Because we only have about an hour, I'm not going to be able to talk about everything. So I'll just talk about the tip of the iceberg. It's a large tip, right? Just the tip of the iceberg. But we're not going to see everything that's buried underneath the surface unless you ask me questions at the end and we talk about that. But that's an important caveat. Now what I'm going to do, in fact I thought about you when I prepared that slide, and now it's right there, so I'm going to be precise. I'm going to tell you what claims I'm going to make at the outset, so you know what's coming, and then I'm going to try to show you that there are good reasons to believe that those claims are likely to be true. The first claim is that the traditional soul, which I will define in just a moment, is not just a theological or a metaphysical claim, but it's above all a scientific claim. From this follows a number of very important implications. The first is that if it is in fact if the soul that we'll define in a moment is in fact a scientific claim, then that means that in principle we have the means to decide objectively whether we're likely to have one or not. So in other words, it's not going to be like trying to decide how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, but more like trying to decide how old the Earth is, how far the moon is from the Earth, those kinds of questions for which we can have good answers. I'm going to then show you that science gives us every reason to believe that human beings do not have souls, in the sense that I will make it precise. And that this conclusion has important implications that that extend far beyond the realm of science, into the realm of society and politics and religion, of course, as well. But perhaps more importantly, I want to try to convince you that we have, in fact, nothing to lose by letting go of our soul beliefs, and in fact, that we have something important to gain. I mean, I'm probably preaching to the choir in this kind of environment, right? But I think it's a very important set of points to emphasize. I'll talk about things that you probably haven't heard before. So, here's the plan. Here's the outline. I'm going to start with some background. Then we'll talk about science and the soul. I'll talk about implications, and then we'll take a look at the road ahead. So let's begin with some background. The US population is polled very, very often on a range of issues. People in power like to know what you think, what we think. On the question of the afterlife, the soul, heaven, we've known for a long time now that a huge majority of the American population believes in this kind of narrative. So we have polls here from various corporations, various entities, Barnard, Gallup, Pew, etc., Harris. They're somewhat recent, showing that between 70 and 80% of the US population believes, espouses a version of heaven, survival of the soul after death, the afterlife, etc. As I'm sure you know, as humanists, we are the US is an unusually religious country, given how wealthy we are. In fact, we're an anomaly, we're a statistical outlier in the first world. And we can talk about this more later, it's very interesting. Scientists have begun to actually think about this, wondering, so if you read the scientific literature, which most people don't do, but that we professional scientists do, you see papers like the folk psychology of souls or adults or intuitive mind-body dualism. So scientists, in particular cognitive scientists, people working on how the mind works, are beginning to wonder, why is it that these beliefs are still prevalent today in the 21st century? Why is it that so many people believe in a version of the soul narrative? If you drive around, say New Jersey, for example, I snapped that picture driving about 95 miles an hour on 95 north, but I didn't die. See, that's really... after you die, the sign says you will meet God. Well, if you're dead, then something other than you, your physical body, your soul, will meet God. So we have a country in which we advertise religious ideas and concepts as passionately as we do toothpaste and fast food or medical, Viagra and soul, there we go. By the way, these are, there's a set of billboards, very, very interesting. The latest one I saw is Jesus is alive, exclamation point. 1-855 for truth, call us now. Gospelbillboards.com. I once called a number, I'll tell you about it later. It was an interesting conversation. If you go to bookstores or if you read the news, this is Newsweek. All part of Newsweek, of course, not some little rundown magazine that two people publish in their basement, pretty mainstream. A few years ago announced it was not April the 1st. On their front page that heaven is real. International news, heaven is real. How do they know? Well, because a former Harvard Medical School neurosurgeon had a near-death experience, said he went to heaven, talked to God, came back, forgot everything that God told him, but wrote a book about it, which reportedly sold millions of copies. A colleague of mine teased me once and said, Julian, if you want to make money, don't write a book called The Soul Fallacy. Have the word heaven in the title, and you're going to make a lot of money. But I also have an intellectual conscience, which can be bought. I can't sell my soul, my non-existent soul, so I didn't do that. But this really, and this is not the only one. There are tons of books that purportedly claim that there's evidence for life after death, 90 Minutes in Heaven. There are movies even that have come out recently based on some of those books. And they are really on the bestsellers list. Now we get to the question that the gentleman in the back asked us about. So if we bring all this together, and I have done studies, by the way, empirical studies with my students at Rutgers. I wanted to know, I wanted to find out whether people that take my psychology classes, neuroscience classes, actually believe in the soul narrative. And quite to my surprise, they do. So when you put all that information together, you get a very clear picture of the kind of soul that people believe in. Most people in America today, in the 21st century, believe in a soul that has three important properties. The first is that it's believed to be immaterial, non-physical. So separate and distinct from the body. This is material, people think the soul is immaterial. Can't see it, can't touch it, can't measure it. The second property, if you ask people questions, is that they tell you that their soul does something for them. It just doesn't sit there looking pretty, or you can't see it. But it gives them a sense of a moral compass, how to tell right from wrong, consciousness, free will, the ability to make decisions. Forget about thinking fast and slow. That's not what really, it's the soul that gives you the ability to make decisions. Your personality, etc. So it does something for you that is of a psychological nature, hence the idea that it is psychologically potent. And finally, it's immortal. It's the part of yourself that will, so people believe that, will carry your consciousness into the afterlife and will help you recognize grandma in heaven without a pair of eyes. But people really believe this, a pair of immaterial eyes. So that's the kind of soul that we're going to talk about. Okay. Now, is this the only way to define the soul? Of course not. Do all the people in the country believe in exact? Of course not. But that is the prevalent set of beliefs. Most people believe in something like that. So now we have a precise definition. And the books that defend the soul that I showed you, that's the kind of soul they go for. And that's the kind of soul that they defend. So now we have a precise definition that we can talk about. So when I talk about the traditional soul, then that's what I'm going to mean. Very close to what Descartes in the 17th century proposed. He's a famous proponent of substance dualism. Very close to what Plato, before Descartes, centuries before Descartes, proposed. He was also a dualist. So it's a version of mind-body dualism. I asked people many more questions. I can tell you about that later. I asked them where they thought they received their souls, at what moment, etc. So we can talk about this. But that's enough to get us going. Now, if you step outside of the real world and enter the interesting world of the ivory tower of professional science, you find that scientists do not think the way that most people think about those questions at all. They're kind of shy about this. They talk about this amongst themselves, but don't really say much about it publicly for reasons that I'll go into a bit later. But here's a quote from a cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard, Joshua Green. Moral Triumphs, by the way, is a book that he wrote, which is absolutely amazing if you're interested in morality. It's a very, very good book. But here's the quote. So most people, Green says, are dualists. So body and soul, mind-body dualism. Intuitively, we think of ourselves not as physical devices, but as immaterial minds or souls housed in physical bodies. Okay. We scientists take the mind's physical basis for granted. Among the general public, it is a touchy subject. Indeed it is. So just to give you a sense of what, there's data also on what scientists believe. This is a poll that was taken in 1998, published in the very prestigious journal Nature. The title was "Leading Scientists Still Reject God." And in it there was data about what leading scientists think about God, but also immortality and the soul. So this is 1914. Turn of the 20th century, right at the beginning of the First World War, and you see that only about a third, almost, in fact, more than a century ago, of elite scientists, members of the National Academy, believed in the soul narrative. Compare that to about 70 to 80% of the general population. It's a huge decrease. But now look at what happens as the 20th century unfolds. So you're going to see 1933 and now 1998. And you see that the percentage of elite scientists who believe in the soul narrative is really, it's less than 8%. So that means that about 92% of elite scientists do not believe in the soul narrative. It's about the same proportion, just a little less compared to what compared to the proportion of scientists now, climate scientists, who think that climate change is real and B, that we are causally responsible for it. So if that's not a consensus, I don't know what is, when you have 90-something% of a group who thinks one way. So striking contrast between professional scientists on the one hand and non-scientists on the other. Non-scientists on the left, lay people, nothing wrong with being a layperson. Believe me, scientists can be hard to deal with sometimes, especially when you work with them all day long. But people, most people are dualistic. Right? Think of the body and soul. Most scientists are materialists. They think, so I have the picture, it's kind of a gruesome picture of Arnold as a Terminator. And the analogy is that the Terminator in the movies was a robot, a cyborg, a creature that looked very much like a human being, that could talk and think and reason like a person, was even conscious, but we know that that creature is a machine. There's no soul, no vapor, spiritual, anything about it. It's just material through and through. Well, that's the way that we scientists think about human beings today. That, of course, we're not cyborgs, we're not programmed to kill Sarah Connor, but we are biological versions of the Terminator. We're material through and through. We know the exact chemical composition of the human body. We know where the elements came from millions of years ago when big stars exploded to create the heavy elements, etc., etc. So that's the view. It's very different from what most people think. Now you might say, great, who cares? Okay? Is it just an academic exercise? Well, it turns out it's not, because whether or not you are a materialist or a dualist has an implication. Beliefs actually matter. They guide action. Ah, we have another question from our friend back there. Yes?
Yeah, what do you understand by material?
What do I mean by material?
Yes.
Okay. Should I go into this now, or, in fact, I have an analogy,
Okay.
and I have a definition just now, a hypothesis. So let's hold this thought for just a second.
Thank you.
Wait till after your discussion for questions? Well,
You tell me what the question is, and I will exercise my free will to decide. I'll answer it now or later. So please, go ahead.
well, no, that's what was my suggestion, that we wait till after.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it's a bit better because then, right, exactly. But I love the Q&A. And what the wonderful lady said earlier, I like arguments. I mean, I live in the Ivy Tower. That's what I do all day long. I argue with people. I should be a lawyer. So I love that. I mean, you know, in a fun way. I smile all the time. So I think it's fun. I like to have an intellectual life. And I like to share this with people. Thinking is nice and fun. And we don't do enough of it in this country. Anyway, so who cares? Well, we should all care. Because it turns out that whether or not you believe in the soul narrative versus materialism has an impact on this nagging question that resurfaces and is rehashed every election cycle in the United States, unlike any other first world country. If only we could deal with abortion, we'd live so well, wouldn't we? The economy, climate change, forget about it. That's what really matters. But it does matter. Stem cell research. I remember the Bush administration, when we thought things were bad. Worse since then. Whether you think in dualistic or materialistic terms has an impact on this question as well. The question of whether we should have the right to die with dignity. If you were born a cat or a dog in this country, you have the right to die with dignity. If you're sick and you're suffering, it's legal to put you to sleep in a humane fashion. If you happen to have been born Homo sapiens sapiens, you're out of luck. Because we can't do that in most of the states. There are a handful of states in the US where this is actually legal. Oregon, Montana, or a few of them. In Switzerland, where I spent 5 years of my life as an undergrad, it's been legal since the 1940s, as some of you might know. But that's also a huge issue. And finally, not obviously on the surface, but I'll talk about this more because it's so interesting intellectually. It turns out that how we view moral responsibility and criminal punishment, how we should punish people, hinges on whether or not we take human nature to be dualistic or materialistic. So huge implications across a number of very interesting domains. So now we're going to talk about, having set the stage, talk about science and the soul. So the first point I want to convince you of, most people think otherwise, is that the soul that we define, really is a scientific hypothesis. It's not just a religious, theological, metaphysical question. It really is a scientific question. And this comes from two facts about those alleged claims, those beliefs. The first has to do with detachability and autonomy of function. On this view of the soul is separate from the body, continues to function when the body disintegrates, so it's detachable and autonomous. Okay? So it means that the mind, essentially, or some aspect of the mind, can exist and function independently of the physical body. And the second reason why the claim is a scientific one is that, remember, point number 2 is that your soul is psychologically potent. It allows you to do things of a psychological nature. It gives you a moral compass, gives you free will, gives you feelings. And so to do that, it must obviously have the ability to causally interact with your body and your brain, i.e. ordinary matter. Well, if you're going to say that some immaterial substance is going to interact causally with ordinary matter, you are making a claim about physics. Okay? Because physics is the branch of human knowledge that deals with how ordinary matter behaves. In fact, so I want to take a step back and say something else here. This amounts to saying, or to answering the following question, could there be evidence that the soul is autonomous and detachable from the body? Yes, there could be. So for example, suppose it was possible to talk to the dead. Okay? Suppose it was possible to talk to the dead. Suppose you have Aunt Emma's ashes in an urn on your fireplace mantle, and now you know for a fact that the body has ceased to function. Pretty good evidence. But now suppose that you can somehow receive information from Aunt Emma, and that she tells you where she hid her ring, for example, and you find it. Now, of course, I'm joking about this, but you could do, in principle, if you did controlled experiments like that, and find out that you can indeed communicate with the dead, what would that tell you? It would tell you that even though the body is gone, something about the mind continues to work. So if such evidence were available, it would be pretty convincing evidence that something like the soul actually exists. So in principle, because it's something that could exist, it makes the claim very scientific, and we can measure in this world whether or not this is something that is possible. In fact, James Randi, the amazing Randi, had until 2015, as you know, $1 million prize that he could award to anyone who could show under rigorous scientific conditions that something like that was possible. So it's the idea that it's in principle possible that makes the claim scientific. Likewise, if physicists have theories of how fundamental particles behave. There's something called quantum field theory, okay, that describes how electrons and other particles work. It's a complete theory. If you read people like Sean Carroll, Lawrence Krauss, for example, they'll talk to you about that. It's fully understood. Well, so that means if the soul actually is there, you should observe deviations from those laws of physics. If you don't have deviations, then the body and the mind work according to the laws of physics, and that's it, it's physical. But if the soul somehow is able to interact causally with its translucent fingers, then you should observe deviations from the laws of physics. Right? So in principle, this is something that you can find evidence for. And I'm not the first one to, I'm the first one to flesh this out in so many details, but if you read, say, Bertrand Russell, back in 1935, a classic Living in Science, he has a quote in there, there's a little section on the soul in which he says, I'm quoting almost verbatim, that there could be evidence that would convince reasonable men that something like the soul is correct. What he had in mind is precisely what I mentioned to you. This was 1935. If you read books now by proponents of the afterlife and the soul and everything, they'll tell you, oh, there's scientific evidence that the soul exists. But these people are not scientists, they don't understand science, but they make the claims nonetheless. Okay, so now we get to, you're always like a slide or two ahead of me, that's very impressive. But I anticipated your questions. So here's now how we can turn these two views into concrete hypotheses. We have a dualistic hypothesis on the one hand, which is the soul hypothesis, which is that human beings are composed of a physical body and an immaterial, psychologically potent, and immortal soul, the soul that we defined earlier. Body and soul are distinct entities, and the soul can continue to exist and function independently from the body after we die. That's the dualistic plane. By contrast, the materialistic plane, so here we get to something precise, the mind, the domain of the soul today at least, cannot function separately from the body for the simple reason that our mental experiences are caused by physical activity in our brains. What we call mind is nothing but a description of the functioning of the brain at a certain level of abstraction. If this isn't clear, I'll clarify this for you later with analogies. Body and mind are therefore two sides of the same coin. In fact, I'll take 2 minutes to give you an analogy, because I think it's worth it. I don't have slides for it because that's a more condensed version, but imagine the following situation. Suppose that you have a, let's go back in time. You guys are all old enough to, you just have a couple years on me, all old enough to, no reaction to this? I'm impressed. More than a couple. I just turned 27. Okay, good.
I'll be 85 next week.
There you go. So that's what I said. A couple years with me.
I think I might know something.
Absolutely. So imagine that, so let's go back in time a few decades, a portable radio set. Right? So, and you have headphones. You turn on the radio set, you plug in your headphones, pick your favorite station, start listening to music. And now somebody says, they'll ask you, where does the music come from? Well, you would say, look, we have this physical device here called the radio set, and it's interacting with a set of electromagnetic waves, radio waves that are beamed through space that the radio set is able to decode into music. You have two separate elements, right? The radio waves and the radio set are independent entities, right? So translate that as the radio set is your body, and the radio waves are your mind. It's not a perfect analogy because radio waves are physical things, described by physical theories, but that the detachability and independence are preserved. Now, if you smash the radio sets to bits, it's destroyed, it doesn't affect the signal. The signal is still there. It can still, somebody else perhaps could receive it. That's dualism. Mind is the radio waves, body is the radio set. By contrast, if you take materialism, imagine a music box. You're cranking the little thing and it starts playing music. And now somebody says, where does the music come from? Well, in this case, the music comes from the physical operation of the physical device that you call a music box. It emerges from the physical operation. If you smash the thing to bits, it's not really music anymore, right? So the music is not independent, it's caused by the music box. That's materialism. The mind consciousness are byproducts, causal byproducts of the physical self. No physical self, no mind. No music box, no music. Unless, of course, you record it. In the future, maybe we'll be able to record or download our consciousness into machines, but that's a separate question. That'd be an unnatural way to do things. Possible maybe down the road. Just like today, just to finish the analogy, we can't naturally breathe underwater. If you don't believe me, try your bathtub tonight. It's not going to last very long. But we've, well, don't, he's like, oh man, no, don't try that. But we have devised technology a long time ago called scuba diving equipment that allows us to artificially breathe underwater. Likewise, we can't fly naturally. You can, like, you know, have a little cape, pass you, jump off the roof of your house, not going to work very well, gravity will take its effect. But we have airplanes, helicopters that allow us to artificially fly. Nothing about the laws of nature says that one day we won't be able to become artificially mortal, but the claim is that we are naturally mortal, just like we naturally can't breathe underwater or fly. Okay, so now we have two hypotheses. Notice that they're mutually exclusive. They can't both be true, which is nice. Either one is true or the other, but not both. It's like flat Earth and round Earth. The Earth can't both be flat and round. It's one or the other, and we happen to know which it is. So then, how can we decide whether it's more likely that we live in a world in which dualism is true or materialism is true? Well, we look at the evidence. We do what scientists have been doing for a few years. And when we do that, it turns out that all the evidence points away from dualism, and all the evidence points toward materialism. To be more precise, so there's something in philosophy of science that philosophers call consilience of evidence. Consilience, the idea that you have different lines of evidence, of reasoning that converge on a set of conclusions. That's how we know that evolution is not just a theory, as you've heard so many times, because there's so much evidence from the fossil record, from molecular biology, from comparative anatomy, etc., that all points in the same direction. Likewise for climate change. Okay? So it's the same thing here. And I'm going to give you a taste of what that is without going into all the details because we don't have time. But you can ask me questions later about this. The first line of reasoning or evidence is that the soul, the domain of the soul, has shrunk as scientific understanding has progressed. There used to be many souls, if you go back in time. Ego souls and life souls and free souls and everything. Souls initially, if you look at history, were an attempt on the part of our pre-scientific ancestors to make sense of psychological and biological properties before we had science to understand those. As science progressed, as we understood more about psychology and biology, the number of souls started to diminish until there was one, the traditional soul. And it corresponds to things that we still don't quite fully understand, consciousness and the like. Okay? The second, and again, I'm happy to talk more about this, I'm just giving you a highlight. The second is that there's no formalism that describes the so-called soul substance. Formalism is very important in science. When Isaac Newton, in 1687, published his masterpiece, The Principia, he described the laws of motion, but also the gravitational force. He was really puzzled by that. If you read him, I have the quote, but not here, he said that it basically didn't make sense. It didn't make sense that matter could have this property of acting on each other at a distance instantaneously through a vacuum, but he had a formula, he had equations that allowed scientists to make very clear predictions about how matter was going to behave. That came to replace Cartesian physics, what was called contact mechanics. So formalism is very interesting. In fact, there's a footnote in Newton where he says, whether that force be material or immaterial, I leave to my readers to decide. Wasn't sure. Right? So you might say, well, if someone like Newton said that it could be something immaterial, why not propose an immaterial soul? Fine, do it, but give us equations that are going to make predictions about people's behavior. Those do not exist. All you have are lousy analogies like, oh, the soul is like a vibrating guitar string. Yeah, great. That's going to tell me whether I'm going to have breakfast or not tomorrow. Sure. So that's important. There's no objective empirical evidence that supports the soul, but there could be. There could be. We could talk the dead. In fact, if we go back in time, let's say we're all now in ancient Egypt, 5,000 years ago, and it's a beautiful night, and the moon is out there, and we're walking on the beach, and we're chatting because we like to chat. And I tell you, you know what? Last night I talked to my dead mother. What you'd say is, hey, what did she say? On the other hand, if I were to tell you 5,000 years ago, look at the moon, one day we'll have one of us walk on the moon, you just think, I lost my mind. how is it possible to imagine 5,000 years ago that we could have left the Earth, what, with a tall tree or something, to reach the moon? Unimaginable. Well, guess what? We live in a world in which we have men walking on the moon, but in which we can't talk to the dead. But we could have been able to talk to the dead. There's nothing that we can't possibly imagine by doing that. It just happens that we don't have any evidence. So that's a problem, right? So no objective evidence. Souls fly in the face of everything we know about science. The analogy I like to give is like this, and I'm happy to point to things you can read. I mentioned Lawrence Krauss and Sean Carroll. It's a great, short, non-tech, it's one equation, but you don't even have to understand it, called Physics and the Immortality of the Soul, in which I just keep thinking about Krauss because we just met him recently, in which Sean Carroll explains that if you believe in the soul, that means you have to reject all known physics and all known experiments that have ever been done. The idea is kind of like that. If I were to claim to you that I have a friend who's a great athlete and can run a marathon under 10 minutes, okay, you would not need to do an experiment. This so fly in the face of everything we know about human locomotion, about the length of marathons, that the claim is just so supremely implausible. Same for the soul, given what we know about modern physics, modern biology, modern neuroscience. There's no explanatory gain that comes from postulating the existence of the soul. The soul doesn't explain anything. That's because, historically, it's a name that we have given to our ignorance. Soul is whatever we don't understand. So it can't explain anything. In fact, it doesn't. Try this. Say that consciousness is bizarre and magical and we don't understand. We don't really understand all of it. So now I say to you, fine, you don't understand consciousness? Here's how it works. The soul does it. Now ask yourselves this question. Do you now understand consciousness better? No. Okay, so no explanatory gain. And finally, there's overwhelming evidence that supports the other side of the coin, namely materialism. So, to a modern scientist, the soul has exactly the set of properties that it should have if it didn't exist, and that's why we have stopped believing in it. Just like we stopped believing in phlogiston, the caloric theory, the luminiferous ether, and other obsolete theories that have been relegated to the dustbin of history. So now you might say, what about the evidence that people like Dinesh D'Souza claim exists? There's a nice trick that they pull on people, consciously or not. They're not scientists, they don't seem to understand science very well, or maybe they pretend that they don't understand science very well. What they do is if you take, say, the set of all possible things that one could call evidence. So for example, to give an analogy, is there evidence that the Earth is immobile? Plenty. There's how we feel. Okay? It doesn't feel like it's moving at 67,000 miles an hour around the sun. So I'll say this is evidence for a stationary Earth. But of course, if you take, so that's why those guys can say, look, there's evidence for the soul right here. So the soul is correct. But they invariably forget to tell you that we've had 400 years of science, take or give a few years, and now we know how to make the distinction between evidence that is scientifically acceptable and evidence that isn't. The fact that I feel that the Earth isn't moving is not acceptable evidence to say that it's not moving. We know this now. So that's the trick they pull. It's a little more complicated, right? But to people who are already convinced or don't know science very well, it seems to work quite well, but not to mainstream scientists. So implications now. Okay, we're going to turn to implications now. A common reaction I get, maybe not among humanists, but among a larger audience of people when I suggest, powerfully or forcefully, that the soul may not exist, is I get this kind of reaction. People kind of freak out. Oh my, no, not, well, yeah, my God, I guess. Oh, Darwin, what have you done? And students in particular do that. Well, it's as sincere as those feelings are, I think they're misguided. Because for the most part, nothing changes. So what do I mean by that? Analogy, I'm going to use. I like analogies, they're good. So let's take the difference between facts and their explanation. So take an apple or a clicker or this nice fancy projector. If I were to hold it here and release it, it would fall to the ground. Unless it was attached by a cable or whatever. And we could repeat this, it would happen over and over again. If the fact has any meaning in English, that's a fact. A fact that releases physical objects drop to the ground. Now, how do we explain that? Why do these things happen? Well, depends on who you ask. If you go back in time and say, go to Aristotle, then Aristotle had an idea about, a theory about why this happened. It was teleological, goal-oriented. Things went to their natural place because they wanted to go there. 17th century scientific revolution, Isaac Newton famously explained this fact differently. He said, look, there's a goalless force of gravity attracting people to one another. That's why apples fall to the ground. That's why planets do what they do. That's why we have the tides. A fact that Bill O'Reilly hasn't yet fully digested, apparently. Tide goes in, tide goes out. Remember? When somebody pointed out to him that actually was the effect of the moon and the sun, undaunted, he posted a clip of himself on YouTube, and he said, hey, but where did the moon come from? You can't answer that. It turns out we can't. But anyway, it's very and then later on in the early 20th century, Albert Einstein famously, in both the miracle year 1905 and 1915, came up with the theory of relativity, which explained gravity in a different way. It has to do with what's called the curvature of space-time. So explanations have changed, but the fact has not changed. Apples fell to the ground at the time of Aristotle, at the time of Newton, at the time of Einstein, and they will continue to fall to the ground in the foreseeable future until the universe dies, and nothing happens. Good. So now we can transpose the analogy to, oh, by the way, before we do that, you, I hope, realize now that it would be silly for someone to be alarmed and freak out upon hearing that, say, Newton's theory was not the right one, and say, oh wow, Newton was wrong, Aristotle was wrong, all my precious possessions, material possessions, are going to fly off into the sky. No, they're not. Explanations change, but not facts. So transposing that to human beings, what are a comparable set of facts about people? Well, we haven't been around forever in modern form. We were not planted on Earth 6,000 years ago. We've been around since about 100,000, 150,000 years as modern human beings. There are two things about a healthy human adult. We have complex mental lives. We can be jealous, and we can be proud, and we can be in love, and we can be all kinds of things. And we have flexible behavior, unlike, say, rocks that do much less than we do. And so now the question is, how do we explain that? Why do we have dreams? Why do we have minds? How come we make decisions? How come we have moral intuitions? Well, the answer used to be, we don't have a clue. It's hard. And so we'll say that the soul does it. But now the answer has changed. We now have better ideas, and what we say now is not the soul, it's the chemistry of your brain. But the facts don't change. Healthy, normal adults are still going to enjoy the sunset and fall in love, no matter what scientists say about whether the soul or the brain does it. So freaking out over the demise of the soul is silly in a way, because nothing changes. Apart from the fact that everything changes. Sort of. There's, in addition to our regular abilities, making decisions, having more compass, the soul also gives us two magical powers. One is a particular kind of free will, and the other one is, of course, immortality. The soul's going to continue to carry our consciousness into the afterlife. So no soul means no immortality, at least not that way. And it means that we're going to have to rethink free will. I'm going to say something shocking and outrageous now, which is that immortality is not such a big deal. You might say, how dare you say that? And I'll say to you, we'll talk about it during the question session. But I really mean this, and it's not hard to show. I want to focus instead on something I think more interesting, deeper intellectually, which is the question of free will. And how the soul is related to that question. And to do that, I'm going to focus on one of the cases I mentioned earlier, about which the soul narrative has implications, namely our criminal justice system and why we want to punish people who do wrong. So, it's an argument. So I'm going to give you the general flavor for the argument, and then I'm going to show you what the details are. The idea is that, in general, the wrong theories of how the world works lead to the wrong ideas, the wrong practices, and the wrong policies. Right? So it's easy to see, for example, that when people used to believe in witches, as they seriously did in medieval Europe. They thought that witches were women cavorting with demons. They were smart women, by the way. Smart women were called witches back then. Right, and so we've come a long way now. But what people would do is they would kill them, they would burn them, they would actually try to drown them. And if they drowned, then they were witches, they were, you know, innocent. If they actually, too bad, they're dead. But if they came back to the surface, they were witches. It's really crazy. But they did all kinds of things to women. The minute you change the theory, which we have, then there's no more reason to torture women. Right? So the wrong theories of how the world works, and now we don't believe in witches anymore, can lead to horrible practices. Same thing nowadays with, say, poor LGBT people. And take our Vice President, Mike Pence, who believes in conversion therapy. You're gay, get out of it. You'll get over it. It will convert you into it. This is insane, but it's 21st century. You know, if you have any gay friend, as we all do, then it's just terrible. So, bad ideas. Mind-body dualism, it turns out, soul beliefs, is the wrong idea about human nature. Okay? And so it too can lead to the wrong practices, the wrong policies, and the wrong ideas. It turns out that a particular way in which we decide to punish people based on retribution, making them suffer for what they did, is anchored in this flawed notion of human agency. And this is particularly important in the US, where our criminal justice system is so highly dysfunctional. For such, I mean, you're a humanist, I won't need to tell you that. Incarceration rates, we saw the penalty, it's all biased towards the poor, like the proposed bill that died recently. So, I want to now show you how the argument unfolds in its specifics. But to do that, first I need to tell you a bit more about free will. And to do that, I found a cartoon that beautifully illustrates the main intuitive theory of free will. Delbert, you all have heard of Delbert, and his genius dog, Dogbert, not a witch, not a smart woman, just a smart dog, wanted to burn him, asking the question, do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? And Delbert answered, of course. Well, then how can we blame people for their actions? That's a smart dog. And Delbert responds, because people have free will to do as they choose. Well, are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Well, of course it is, but it's just the part of the brain that's out there just being kind of free. the budding scientist in Delbert. Precision. So, you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Well, obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? Shut up. You get challenged, you don't know what to say, you become emotional. That's a typical response. So that illustrates beautifully the notion of free will that is called in the technical philosophical literature libertarian free will, or sometimes contra-causal free will. And we have a definition here from Theopedia, straight from the office of Mike Pence. Libertarian free will means that our choices are free from the determinational constraints of human nature, and that libertarian freedom is essential for moral responsibility. So we have to have libertarian freedom, otherwise we don't have moral responsibility. For if our choice is determined or caused by anything, including our own desires, it cannot properly be called a free choice. So how does this translate into something more concrete? We know that we're complex creatures made of billions of particles, and that there's a range of factors that impinge on us, and eventually, in a very complicated chain of events, lead us to think what we think and do what we do. The genes that we have play a role, the kind of brains and the brain chemistry that operate, that under the hood have a role to play too. The laws of nature have a role to play. Your life history plays a role. The environment in which you find yourself, the state of the universe. But notice that all these are causal forces about which we have no control. You can't control the genes you have or the laws of nature. So for a libertarian, that's a problem. They'll say, look, if our will is caused by anything, then it can't be free.